Thanks to everyone for joining us. I'm Sally Davies, Senior Editor at Aeon Magazine, and it's my pleasure to facilitate today's meetup on the ethics of cost-benefit analysis. So as many of you will know, this way of evaluating policy interventions is ubiquitous across healthcare systems and beyond, touching on our lives in manifold ways, including how we approach problems such as air pollution, food safety, and pandemic preparedness, among many others. We're going to hear from the panel today about the reasons that benefit cost analysis is so widely accepted, what its drawbacks are, what the alternatives might be, and how we might get there. So to begin, we're just going to have the panelists introduce themselves. Each will then give a short presentation and we'll conclude with a question and answer session at the end. And the whole meetup should run just to an hour. So let's begin. Lisa, do you want to begin the introductions?
Sure. I'm Lisa Robinson. I'm a senior research scientist at the Center for Health Decision Science and the Center for Risk Analysis at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And I'm also the deputy director of the Center for Health Decision Science.
Thank you. Ulla, you're next on my screen. Oh, you're muted, Ulla.
I'm Ole Norheim. I'm a professor of medical ethics and director of the Bergen Center for Ethics and Priority Setting, and also an adjunct professor of global health at Harvard Chan School of Public Health.
Thank you. Matthew, you're next.
Yes, I'm Matthew Adler, I'm professor of law and professor of economics, philosophy, and public policy at Duke University.
Thank you. And finally, you, Christian.
Hi, my name is Christian Kreckel. I'm an assistant professor in behavioral science at the London School of Economics.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to commence the presentations with you, Lisa.
Okay, thanks. Let me see if I can get my slides back up.
Should also say while Lisa is preparing her presentation, if you have any questions, do feel free to drop them in the chat, and the panelists will either respond directly or I can pick them up in the question and answer session.
Okay, should I go ahead?
Go for it.
Okay, so we're going to be talking about the ethics of benefit cost analysis. We focus on, we call this healthy, wealthy, and wise because we want people to be in good health. We want them to have decent income, and we want to be smart about the choices that we make. The starting point for this meetup is a conference that the Foundation Brochet sponsored last summer. I organized it along with Nir Eyal, Samuel Hurst, and Dan Wickler. It took us 2 or 3 years to get there because of COVID after a couple of delays, but it was a terrific conference. What we've done today is brought together a few people who represent different approaches that were discussed at that conference, building on what we talked about there. The idea here, as Sally said, is the conventional benefit cost analysis is well established and widely used to assess health-related policies around the world. However, it's based on really strong normative assumptions that can be challenged on ethical grounds. So today we're going to talk about different approaches to try and answer the core question of how we should measure the effects of policies on individual and societal well-being. So what is benefit cost analysis? You could think of it as any way of weighing good things and bad things, but technically in conventional benefit cost analysis, what we focus on is what we often call opportunity cost. If we spend something, our time, our labor, materials on one thing, we can't use that same time or that same material for something else. One distinguishing characteristic of benefit cost analysis is we measure both improvements and harms using money metrics. The idea is to facilitate the comparison of dissimilar impacts. The methods we use also provide some information on the preferences of people affected by the policy for spending money on different things. I know a grocery store example might seem kind of strange for a webinar that's focused on valuing life and health, but the idea here is that money's derived from values derived from how much money people are willing to pay or accept for an outcome that they themselves experience. So it's not that different from walking into the grocery store and thinking about how much money do I want to spend on this one thing. And if I spend that money on this thing, I can't use that same money to buy something else. Underlying this approach is the assumption that we are each the best or the most legitimate judge of our own welfare. We try not to be paternalistic. There are, of course, some exceptions, like small children who we don't think are very good at making these judgments and don't control financial resources. Where we can, we rely on market data for valuation. The idea here is that if we choose to spend our money on one thing, just like on the previous slide, we value it at least as much as the other things that are more than the other things we could use that same money to buy. For things that aren't bought and sold in markets, which include health, longevity, as well as many environmental outcomes, we either use surveys, stated preference methods, where we ask people what they'd be willing to pay, working very hard to make sure that people understand what it is we're asking them to value, or we use similar products that have whatever it is we're trying to value as an attribute, and try and sort out the value of that attribute from other things. A common approach here is to use the trade-off between job-related risk and wages to try and estimate how much people value an increase or decrease in job-related risk. Our overall goal here is simply to describe the extent to which individuals as members of society are willing to reduce our consumption of other goods and services to achieve a specific policy option. Sorry, the reason I have a toolbox in the corner of this slide is that I think of benefit cost analysis or any type of policy analysis as a tool for helping us to understand policy impacts. It's widely used around the world by government agencies, by international organizations and nonprofits. There are many, many sources of guidance on how to do this type of analysis. I don't know anyone, though, who does this sort of work in the trenches who would argue that you should base a decision solely on the results of the benefit cost analysis. There's lots of things that are uncertain or that we can't quantify, in addition to the sorts of ethical issues we're talking about today. Its most important role is in providing a systematic approach to encourage us to systematically look at the impacts of policies. I'm not going to talk about this exhibit at all. I would very quickly run out of time. I just wanted to let you know that this is the overall framework for doing benefit cost analysis. We use pretty much the same framework for the sorts of approaches that the others will be talking about. But we're not going to talk about all these different steps. There's plenty of places, including the document that's on your screen, where you can learn more. The normative issues or the ethical issues, I think, sort of boil down to three categories. One is whose costs and benefits count. We talk about this as standing or perspective. In conventional benefit cost analysis, the usual thinking is we should count everything, benefits and harms, regardless of to whom they accrue. The second is how we derive values. This goes back to my grocery store picture of basing values on willingness, individuals' willingness to exchange their own money for their own impacts. And then how our policies evaluated, we compare total cost to total benefits and assess distribution separately. This separation of distribution from total effects is an important concern. But what I'm going to talk about now very quickly is just how we value mortality risk reductions. I often say that this terminology that we use, the value per statistical life, if I could get in my time machine and go back in time and change that language, I would do it immediately because it gets us in so much trouble. People think we are placing a value on their life, but it's actually a little different. So on the side there, you see a whole bunch of policies that are just examples: education, traffic accident, pictures, air pollution, could be COVID, nutrition, healthcare. In all of these cases, we don't know what individual people will die if we don't implement the policy. We also don't know whose death will be averted by the policy. All that we know is, based on previous studies, we think that the policy will lead to a risk reduction. So we're talking about an aggregation of probabilities. That's why we use the term statistical. In the calculation at the bottom of the slide, I use 1 in 10,000 because that's about the size of the individual risk reduction for many of these policies. It's very small. So what's the value? Well, going back to the grocery store again, it's the individual rate at which we are willing to exchange changes in our own mortality risk for changes in our spending in other goods and services. It's not the value that somebody else is placing on your life. This slide probably has more words on it than it should, but the main points here are that these values include a lot of different things. They include any changes in earnings, changes in costs that accrue as a result of the risk reduction. They include what we often talk about as the joy of living, non-pecuniary effects. And when we're talking about, I'm sorry? And they they need to take, when we take into account the fact that if we spend more while we're alive, we'll have less to bequeath to others when we die. We know from both theory and empirical evidence that the values vary depending on your characteristics, how old you are, that sort of thing, and on the nature of the risk, how scary it is. But in real world applications, we use population averages, both because there's some gaps and inconsistencies in the research, and because this term, the values per statistical life, is so widely, it's such a wide source of confusion that it's easier just to use the standard value. This is just an illustration of how we calculate it. You'll see the numbers that are in this illustration, the 1,000 and the 10 million, are chosen intentionally because that's roughly what the value is in the US. The population average VSL in the US actually this year is probably around 11 or 12 million. But all that number is taking individual willingness to pay from underlying studies, dividing by the risk change, and that gives you this VSL. The reason we do this is partially because it's really makes it much easier. You just multiply the change in expected deaths by this value. You can also think about this as aggregating a value throughout the population. If each of us is willing to pay $1,000, there's 10,000 of us. And one statistical case is averted, then you also get to a value of 10 million for that case. The important point here is that the fundamental concept is how much we are each willing to pay to reduce our own mortality risk. The conversion to the VSL is largely for convenience. So to wrap up, the conventional benefit cost analysis is well established and widely used. I've been doing this sort of work for something like 40 years, and I've found that the fact that it's so systematic makes us discover all sorts of unexpected things about policy impacts. Lots of guidance out there, strong normative assumptions should never be the sole basis for a policy decision. And if nothing, at most, it needs to be supplemented with information on distribution and on non-quantified effects. So thank you. If you're interested in these issues, we will be talking about this more in March at the Society for Benefit Cost Analysis meeting.
Thank you so much, Lisa. A really helpful introduction to the subject. I'm going to pass over to Christian now to provide an overview about subjective wellbeing.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm talking about well-being now and how we can use self-reports of life satisfaction in cost-benefit analysis. And I would like to start off and sort of like ask, okay, what is well-being? What do we understand as well-being? And I just want to like motivate this with sort of like what Lisa said in her talk, namely willingness to pay and how it is sort of derived. Where we sort of derive willingness to pay our measure of benefit from markets, from market prices. But there might be cases, in many cases, where markets might not be perfectly functioning. There might not be markets at all for some things we value quite a lot. Things like our relationships, the environment, climate, things like our mental health, for example. So that might be a problem. Another problem might be that, you know, sometimes we are not particularly good at estimating how much we would be willing to pay for certain things. That might be because the question might be very hypothetical. It might be because it's sort of like it's cognitively very difficult to compute. There might be various biases simply arising when you directly ask people how much they would be willing to pay something. So we essentially suggest a different way to value benefits for cost-benefit analysis, and that simply relies on asking people how they are doing when they're going about their lives, right? So we want to look at people's self-reported subjective well-being, in particular their self-reported life satisfaction. And also an important difference is here that actually we do not make any assumptions on rationality, right? We basically assume that people go about their lives, they sort of correctly report how they feel, but we do not assume that they perfectly rationally make all the choices that sort of maximize the expected utility. So our measure, which we are putting forward, is what we call the well-be. It's a well-being year, our measure of benefit. It's defined as 1 point of life satisfaction, which is typically measured on a 0 to 10 scale for one person for 1 year. And I've just given you one example of such a Likert scale, which we typically use. And the well-be is simply a jump from, say, 5 to 6. And we can estimate how much a well-be would be worth in monetary terms if we want to convert it into money. And we've done this in the UK. And in the UK, it's about 14,000 pounds in 2022 prices. So that's approximately the value of one well-being, 1 unit of life satisfaction for one person for 1 year. Why should we look at that instead of simply willingness to pay, simply market prices? Well, I think there are a couple of reasons which are quite compelling. One thing is it can be seen as very democratic. So we basically ask people how they feel about their lives and use this as some sort of like benefit, right? So that's sort of the idea that there's one person, one vote, and everybody counts equally. So it's a very utilitarian perspective, but it's also open and flexible to other perspectives. For example, giving more priority to people who are at the lower end of the well-being distribution. I think Matt's going to talk about this after my talk. If you ask people, what they care about in their lives, basically life satisfaction always comes out as a very important life outcome amongst with health. It correlates very highly with objective outcomes, longevity, for example. People who are scoring higher in terms of life satisfaction also associated with living longer. It predicts behavior very well, for example, voting behavior. And what I like particularly about it as a behavioral scientist, it also captures behavioral scientific phenomena, which are very important for cost-benefit analysis, namely anticipation and misprediction of policies, the fact that we adapt to changing life circumstances and hence do not generate the same benefits over time as we did at the start of the policy. There might be simply relative comparisons to other individuals. We might be jealous of other people if their private consumption increases in a visible manner. That might have negative private consumption externalities on us and actually reduce our life satisfaction. And also it captures things which are important, like how policies are implemented. Things like are people treated fairly with dignity, things which we call procedural utility, which are also sometimes more important than the main policy outcome. And what is from a practical perspective important is that data on life satisfaction is very easy and cheaply to collect and actually quite straightforward to analyze. And what we have accumulated over the past decades is a very large and readily usable evidence base. So we know coefficients, causal coefficients of different policy changes, different changes in life circumstances on people's self-reported life satisfaction. We're varying degrees of quality of the evidence, but we sort of like are having a steadily increasing evidence base here, and we can actually use this for policy appraisal and evaluation. And we're doing this quite actively in the UK. Just to give you an example how this is done in the UK. So in the UK, there's one big book, which is called the Green Book. It's actually really green, so it's depicted here on the right-hand side, which is sort of like the official guideline for policy analysis. And it's published by the Treasury. And it does actually permit policy analysis based on well-being data. And there was, in 2021, there was a supplementary guidance published on well-being. And basically that sort of like looks at how we can use well-being in social cost benefit and social cost effectiveness analysis. And importantly, the kind of like measure of benefit that is suggested here is the well-being. So 1 unit of life satisfaction for 1 unit, for one person for 1 year at the prices which I've outlined above, namely about 14,000 pounds in today's prices. And it can actually, and it's suggested how to use this really for decision making. So making a decision when there's budget constraints, when resources are scarce, and deciding on which policies to fund. So as I said, we suggest the well-be as our value for benefit, and we can use it also to value life if we want to. So we know, for example, that on average, a UK resident generates around 615 well-be's over the lifetime. I simply calculated this from taking the mean life satisfaction of 7.5 on a 0 to 10 scales times 82 life years on average, which is 640. If we know that one well-being is valued at about £14,000, we can calculate that this yields a value of life accumulated, simply the monetized accumulated well-beings over life per resident in the UK of about 8.7 million, which is quite close to Lisa's value of the statistical life she has derived. And yeah, so just like to finish on, if we want to like maximize sort of well-being in society as sort of like the happy planner, what would we do? Sort of we would try to maximize total well-being in society. That goes via two ways. We can either increase life satisfaction, so the quality of life in society, or we can increase sort of length of life. So we should try to make people live longer and happier, and that's sort of like what we should try to maximize, and we should sort of like do this in a way that is most cost effective in terms of spending. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian. Next up, we've got Matthew, who's going to be talking about social welfare functions. Matthew, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Let me share this, and yeah, you guys see that? Okay, perfect. So yeah, I'm going to talk about something called the social welfare function framework. This framework originates in theoretical welfare economics, and it's now well accepted in some literatures within economics, in particular optimal tax theory, climate economics. It's not yet used by governments. This just shows some pretty pictures, which are the covers of some recent works on social welfare functions. My book, Measuring Social Welfare, which came out in 2019, which is meant to be an accessible overview. Handbook of Public Wellbeing and Public Policy came out in 2016. Then more recently, I had the privilege of working with Ulla Norheim in editing this book, Prioritarianism in Practice, that looks at the application of social welfare functions, both utilitarian and prioritarian. I'll talk about that in a second, in different policy domains. All right, so in a nutshell, what is this framework? The framework conceptualizes a given governmental policy as a probability distribution over possible outcomes, where an outcome is just a description of a possible social consequence of policy choice. And the idea of a policy is very generic. It's just some course of action that government might take. There are three key components to the framework. First, there's an interpersonally comparable well-being measure, this W here, which converts an outcome into a list. A vector is a technical term of well-being numbers, one for each person in the population of interest. So, for example, if there are n people, then a given outcome X is converted into the vector W1X to WNX. W1X is the well-being number of individual 1 in X. So here right away, we can see it different from benefit cost analysis, which at least explains, measures outcomes in terms of money. By contrast, the social welfare function framework measures the well-being outcomes directly in terms of this interpersonally comparable well-being measure. Now, what is well-being? Here I'm using well-being in a more generic sense than a Christian, right? So philosophers talk about well-being as simply what's good for someone, right? What makes a life go well, and there are different accounts of well-being out there. So traditionally, economists think of well-being in terms of preference satisfaction. That's indeed the approach that Lisa was talking about with willingness to pay. Happiness or life satisfaction is a different view about the nature of well-being. Well-beings are in effect, life satisfaction as opposed to preference-based measures of well-being capabilities, right? Any view of well-being can be plugged into the social welfare function approach as long as it can be measured, using this interpersonally comparable well-being measure. Once we, have converted outcomes into a list of well-being numbers, we have the social welfare function proper, which is simply a rule for ranking well-being vectors. There are many different social welfare functions. The utilitarian social welfare function simply adds up well-being numbers. A prioritarian social welfare function adds up well-being numbers plugged into a concave transformation function. I'll show that in a second. so as to give more weight to well-being changes affecting those at lower levels of well-being, right? Priority is given to those at lower levels of well-being. And then having adopted a given social welfare function, we need to specify, what might be called an uncertainty module, which specifies how the social welfare function should be applied to policies, which are now understood as probability distributions across well-being vectors. So this shows the idea of prioritarianism, right? If you, on the x-axis there, imagine two people, WL, someone at a low level of well-being or a lower level of well-being, WH, someone at a higher level, right? And we consider increasing each person's well-being by some delta W, right? If you're utilitarian, that's a matter of indifference, right? Your indifference between increasing the well-being of the worse off one by delta W or increasing the well-being of the better off one by the same amount. If you're prioritarian, you prefer to increase the well-being of the worse off one by delta W, and you can see that occurs because of the concavity of this transformation function. And again, there are lots of different, so utilitarianism is a specific social welfare function. Prioritarianism is a whole family of social welfare functions, right? Each one corresponding to a specific, concave function. And the choice of this, prioritarian transformation function is very much an ethical choice, a matter for ethical judgment. All right, let me say something about health policy on specific fatality risks. So by a health policy, I mean one that seeks to improve individuals' health and to reduce fatality risks, typically at some cost and income or other non-health attributes. So here's a very generic framework or model for health policy, right? So an individual's life is divided into periods. So for example, years with a maximum of T periods. So T might be 100 if the periods are years. And then we can think of this thing, which I call a lifetime bundle, which describes, number one, the individual's longevity. That is the number of periods she is alive. And then for each period alive, her period bundle, right, AT on this slide. So we're period health, or period income, et cetera, for each period alive. And so a possible lifetime bundle has the structure, A1, A2, AL. So period bundle, again, of income, health, other well-being relevant attributes for each period alive, and then dead for the remaining periods up to T, which is the maximum, length of life. And then we have a well-being measure, right, which converts this information about longevity and attainments when alive into a well-being number. Okay, so, with this in the background, we can think of a health policy as leading to a lottery over lifetime bundles for each cohort of similarly situated individuals, right? And that lottery is determined by two things. First of all, the cohort survival curve, right? The probability of surviving each period of life. The policy will change the cohort survival curve. The risk, reduction policy will certainly do that. Plus the cohort's attribute profile, right? So the attribute profile says, what period bundle is received by cohort members in each period alive, right? For a given longevity. And what's kind of cool is that understanding how a policy permutes or changes the cohort survival curve and changes its attribute profile, right? We have enough information to determine the lottery over lifetime bundles for each of the different cohorts. With that information, plus the well-being measure, plus the social welfare function, we have all the information we need to evaluate policies. All right, let me just, I want to wrap up because I want to have plenty of time for Q&A. But this is a simulation model, which is in chapter 5 of Measuring Social Welfare, based on the previous slide. It's based on the US survival curve and income distribution. You have a model population composed of 25 age income cohorts. Lifetime well-being is the sum of log income in each year. Log income is sort of a standard well-being function. In this simulation, individuals are not differentiated by health status. So the effect of a policy is to change fatality risks and to change income. I imagine a policy that, across the 25 cohorts reduces fatality risk, that is fatality risk in the next year, by 1 in 100,000, right? And then I consider, well, what's the break-even cost for that, right? I mean, obviously, if we can do that with no cost, we should do so. If we can do that at a very high cost, it's on balance not a good idea. What's the break even, and I calculate this break-even cost for this uniform, again, across the 25 cohorts, 1 to 100,000 fatality risk reduction, using benefit cost analysis, right? Using the VSL concept that Lisa talked about in her slides, also using utilitarianism as well as prioritarianism. Gamma 2 here means kind of a moderate degree of concavity in that transformation function. And, you know, the immediate takeaway from the slide is that the numbers are different, right? So benefit cost analysis is not the same as utilitarianism. It's not the same as prioritarianism, right? A benefit cost actually has a higher break even than both utilitarianism and prioritarianism, and those two are different from each other as well. All right, let me just, one more thing and then I'm going to stop. So what's going on? What's driving the numbers? Well, for each of these methodologies, whether it's benefit cost analysis, utilitarianism, or prioritarianism, we can think about the social value of risk reduction, right? How the methodology values a fatality risk reduction to individuals, you know, in these different cohorts. So in the case of BCA, right, and in these charts, so these are the relative values of fatality risk reduction for individuals in the 25 cohorts, right? In each case, right, the values are normalized to 1. So in the case of BCA, these values are just the VSLs. Now, in practice, as Lisa mentioned, you know, governments use kind of a population average, right? These are VSLs which are not population average. If you actually calculate a VSL for each of the groups using the model, you know, this illustrates the VSLs, right? VSLs here decrease with age and increase with income. And I can talk about in the Q&A, but what one can observe is that BCA is different from utilitarianism. So BCA, for example, with these heterogeneous VSLs is more skewed toward the rich than utilitarianism. Prioritarianism, even utilitarianism is skewed to the rich in valuing risk reduction, and prioritarianism can reverse that. All right, let me stop there, and you know, happy to take more questions in Q&A.
Fantastic. Thank you, Matthew. Really interesting stuff. And now to conclude, we're going to hand over to Ula.
Thank you, Sally. And I'll not use slides. I'll just try to kind of summarize and put into context what these great presentations have tried to convey. And Lisa's presentation was on the standard BCA that has had enormous impact on policy, and therefore it's quite relevant, and especially a lot of uptake in health. But one criticism, and I'm talking here about 3 ethical issues that has been voiced against standard BCA is first, that the method used, the willingness to pay method, would, at least in the textbook version, mean or imply that risk reduction for low-income groups are valued less than for high-income groups. People who are better off in terms of income often have a higher willingness to pay for risk reduction. And even if, as Lisa said, that in practice, analysts often take population averages, in principle, this is an important criticism. And the way I see it is that a lot of health economists, for instance, who are working more in the health space and using cost per quality adjusted life years, they prefer that method exactly for this reason. They find it unethical that BCA, in principle at least, could value risk reduction for poor people as less than risk reduction for high income groups. The second issue is related to fair distribution, and especially the distribution of life years. So cost per quality would capture benefits in terms of health adjusted or quality adjusted life years, but benefit cost analysis, basically, there are some attempts to adjust for this, but basically would look at the value of saving a life or a risk reduction of a certain percentage. So that's also an objection against benefit cost analysis. It could also be one virtue of it, because not everyone agrees that the young should have priority over the old, But in cost per quality, typically, not always, but typically saving a young life will give more healthy life years than saving an old life. So these are two important ethical issues around the distribution of risk reduction for rich versus poor and old versus young. And the third issue is, of course, the choice of well-being measure. So whether you measure well-being effects in terms of money or utilities or well-beings matters a lot. And there's a deep philosophical, ethical discussion about the relevant measures, of course. But I think the benefit cost analysis have been very attractive because it's fairly easy to apply. And now we see in the UK the well-being also becoming very popular because it's quite easy and cheap, as Chris said, to measure life satisfaction in simple surveys. So that's also beyond the ethical issues and the theoretical issues, the practical issues about what's possible to do. Second, I want to talk about the response to these ethical issues and that why I'm attracted to this. And first is that benefit cost analysis with some adjustments, as Chris and Matthew have described, is that we're able to capture more than just health benefits as cost per quality adjusted life years can do. So we get a broader measure of well-being, which is very important. And if you apply a prioritarian social welfare function that Matt explained, it's possible to assign, using that framework, to assign a higher social value to risk reduction at younger ages and a higher social value to risk reduction for low income groups. So you can adjust for if you think of these as the deficiencies in standard BCA, you can adjust for that with utilitarian, but especially a prioritarian social welfare function framework, in my view. Finally, I just want to talk a little bit about the applications, because the reason why we wanted to present this discussion to you, and a discussion we had at Brochure this summer, is that this also have practical implications. I lead the Disease Control Priorities Network, the 4th edition, and that type of work providing evidence on economic evaluations to policymakers have had a huge impact. And most of these types of evidence have been cost per quality. But we are interested now in also capturing benefits and burdens beyond health. And one example that all of you have experienced is the example of lockdowns during the pandemic. So if we have focused only on the quality gains on lockdowns, we would probably allow a lot more, a longer duration of lockdowns, of course. But everyone knows that the lockdowns also had an impact beyond health, on income, on unemployment, on education, on happiness, all these other things. So that just illustrates the attractiveness to move to a more broader framework. The same, we plan to do this for DCP, looking at air pollution in big cities where you have health impacts, you have quality of life impacts, you even have climate impacts of such policies, and capturing these broad benefits and the costs is very important. Another issue, clean water, water treatment, or infrastructure. So a lot of issues that are important policy issues where economic evaluation with a broader framework that captures both well-being in as wide as possible sense, and also the impact on the poor and the rich, the young and the old, so you capture distribution, is very important. So this is what we plan to do in DCP4, to compare standard BCA to these more developed methods. So I'm eager, and I think we will be able to show that it makes a difference, the choice of well-being measure, whether you capture distribution or not. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ulla. Really appreciate those presentations. I just wanted to apologise briefly. I've turned my video off just because I have a small 3-month-old breastfeeding baby here, so just multitasking. But thank you all very much. I'm going to pick up to start with on a very interesting question from the chat from Daniel Winkenfeld, who asks whether there's any room in these models for justice. So, for example, if person A has a low well-being because of their choices or bad luck, and person B has a low well-being due to a history of injustice, such as systemic racism, would there be a reason to prefer a policy that improves B's lot relative to one that improves A's? So I guess, is there scope within these models to look at the causes of differences in life satisfaction or well-being, and can that be factored in some way into the policy-making process?
I can jump in. Yeah, it's a great question. So within the social welfare function framework, not yet, right? That is a social welfare function framework. It's inclusive in taking kind of all effects on well-being, but indeed does not differentiate between two people, at the same well-being level with different degrees of responsibility. There's a philosophical argument going back to the literature on so-called luck egalitarianism from the 1980s that says you should do that. And I think an area for theoretical work is how you would, refine the social welfare framework to do that. I mean, one way to do that would be, instead of measuring well-being, to measure well-being opportunity, right? Two people may end up at the same level of well-being, but one with great opportunities that she wasted and the other one with poor opportunities, that she used very well. But right now, the theory of that remains to be fleshed out, and I have not seen many applications, certainly.
So I think that this is a really important point. There are other things in the chat that sort of fall in the same, in the Q&A, that fall into the same category of things that are technically outside of the benefit cost analysis framework, because all we're looking at is this trade-off between your own money and your own outcomes. In my mind, if you're going to do a conventional benefit cost analysis, you really should be writing a lot on these other things and how you think, providing information for a decision maker to take into account. One problem, I think, with many people who do conventional benefit cost analysis is that they don't pay enough attention to these other issues. We just sort of stop at the point where we say, well, here's our benefit cost analysis, here's what it says. However, there's lots of other things you should think about that aren't included in these measures. So it shouldn't be the sole basis for your decision. I think that we need to say more than that. We need to talk about the things that are coming up in the chat.
Yeah, that makes sense. A related point here, it would be interesting to hear. There's a question from Greg Bognar about the comparability of life satisfaction and how realistic it is for that measure to be interpersonally comparable. Christian, would you like to respond to that? I know you've given a response in the chat, but I think it could be worth opening it out to the wider conversation.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating question. And also like an Achilles here, right? Because currently this is still an ongoing research effort. It's very difficult also, like from an epistemological perspective, to simply prove that cardinality exists, right? We kind of assume it, and there people are trying to test this empirically. They look at test, retest reliabilities, how much what's the correlation between my life satisfaction score today and in 2 weeks when things shouldn't be, when my life circumstances shouldn't be changing too much. We can ask people to rate the life satisfaction of people they know, and they're kind of quite good at it. Some people make arguments in terms of use of language. So, we need to have cardinality because otherwise, as human beings, we can't communicate due to evolutionary reasons. So this is still like an ongoing area. And as an empirical working person, I usually argue, randomization in many policy trials might be a big help because of randomization, we simply sort of balance the reporting function between treatment and control group when we estimate policy effects. Yeah, but it's still an ongoing research area. I think, people are actively working on that. I think when I read the literature, my interpretation is that there is evidence for weak cardinality. Whether this is then fully comparable across different countries, if we compare like UK with, say, Korea, there might be different things in how people interpret well-being. But generally, I think I interpret it as weakly cardinal.
To push a bit further on that, Greg raises the point as to whether what flows from this discussion in the literature is that some of the claims made in the field should be hedged with a bit more humility. Do you think that's fair to say?
I think one should always be humble if possible. I think probably it's kind of like the research, I guess the research process that one sort of claims that one's results are so great. But I think, it has to be replicated a lot. And many of the evidence we have is also not causal, right? So some people are actually working right now on sort of developing databases. I think Christopher Barrington-Lay in Canada is working on developing a database of causal life satisfaction coefficients. So much more work needs to be done. The question is, how long should we wait until we are how far we are close to perfection, right? I mean, how much do we want to wait? Or do we want to start in slow steps and iteratively improve this evidence base?
Right. Does anyone else want to jump in on this question? Maybe, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Let me just say, so yeah, I mean, so I think as a normative matter, there's a strong case for the proposition that well-being is one, interpersonally comparable and cardinal in the sense that you can make comparisons not just of levels and differences. So to assume that the best or an appropriate well-being measure has those properties is, I think, strongly justified. By contrast with sort of the traditional view in economics that you can't make interpersonal comparisons. I mean, the only one who thinks that you can't make interpersonal comparisons or even comparisons of differences are traditional economists. Now, whether well-be's in particular or the well-be data are really cardinal is another question. But the assumption that we should be working, or we should strive for, and we should be working with interpersonally comparable, a cardinal measure is, I think, the right way to go.
I'd like to pick up a question from the chat here from Alexander Capron, who asks whether, besides distributional concerns relating to justice, do different means of measurement have different abilities to value intangible factors? For example, individuals' preferences for making decisions for themselves versus being subjected to restrictions imposed for a social benefit. Obviously, this brings to mind COVID restrictions. So does anyone want to jump in on that question, which strikes me as a very interesting one?
I think at least from there's two different issues here, and one is we want to make sure that, and regardless of which type of analysis we're doing, that people understand what it is that's that we're measuring, and what the advantages and disadvantages of that measure are, and the extent to which the approaches that each of us have talked about include those sorts of things clearly varies. But I think a second answer has to do with the question that somebody else raised, which has to do with the fact that it's very hard to do the sort of valuation studies that we use in benefit cost analysis. I think it's also hard to do the sorts of studies that underlie some of the parameter estimates and the approaches that Chris and Matt talked about. I've become convinced over the years I've been doing this sort of work that even though in theory we might be able to develop a study that does exactly what Alexander's describing, we probably need several different studies of the same question, because each one will have advantages and limitations. I think we're best off if we can synthesize a bunch of different studies that address different populations, ask the questions in slightly different ways, do different things with the statistical analysis, and see if they coalesce around an answer. Or do uncertainty analysis if the answers vary very widely.
Mm.
I can take a quick stab. I mean, and I don't want to put words in Kristen's mouth, but I take it in theory, the life satisfaction approach will want to take account of everything that produces life satisfaction, right? Whatever changes someone's life satisfaction or well-being should be taken account of. Now, of course, in practice, we're not going to model everything. We may want to reduce, what we're going to model as a causal source of life satisfaction may depend upon what the data is and so forth, and tractability. Same thing with the preference view, right? In theory, whatever you prefer should be, in my terms, one of the attributes in a lifetime bundle, whether it's just a preference for health and income or some kind of odd preference. that should also be in there in theory. In practice, of course, we're limited. We're going to be more, sparser models because of concerns about modeling tractability and data availability, right? And how to construct a model which is sort of rich enough in terms of the sources of well-being, whether that means well-being or preference satisfaction, and yet tractable and sufficiently grounded in the data out there is really a question of judgment.
I'd be curious to know, could we take some of these methods out for a spin and talk about how they've been applied in real world priority setting? I mean, Matthew, you mentioned that social welfare functions has yet to be adopted by governments, which is, a striking oversight clearly, but are there any examples that we can draw upon that kind of show these differential methods and the different outcomes that flow as a consequence?
Let me just as a quick plug for the book Prioritarianism Practice. So what that tried to do was to show the application of prioritarianism and utilitarianism to different policy domains, including health policy, risk regulation, education, climate change, COVID-19, right? So we tried to, even though it's not used by government, we tried to show, in these case studies, how these prioritarianism, utilitarianism, as compared to, for example, to benefit cost analysis, can be applied and what the implications would be. So yeah, a plug for that book that Oli and I co-edited.
Can I just clarify one thing though, because I think the word priority is being used in a lot of different ways, and one thing is, so you have a fixed budget and you want to decide how to allocate that budget across different medical treatments or across different policies, which is the way the cost effectiveness analysis is often used in health and medicine. So you're really trying to you say, I have this budget and I want to figure out what to fund with it. The second is the way in which Matt's more or less using the term, this is very layman-like, so forgive me, Matt, but it's just sort of, what do we care about more? Poor people, rich people, people with disabilities, that sort of thing. When conventional benefit cost analysis is being used, it's actually rare that it's used for the sort of priority setting where you have a fixed budget. Where it's usually used is you don't have a fixed budget. For example, the government is trying to figure out how to reduce risk from air pollution from coal-fired power plants. Benefit cost analysis will look at 3 different ways to regulate that pollution. In that case, the costs fall on the regulated community, they get passed on to consumers. There's no fixed budget. So it's not really priority setting, it's more sort of choosing among a set of options to address a very narrowly specified problem.
If I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
If I may jump in here also, so in the World Health Organization issued some guidance for priority setting in health, where cost effectiveness was one of the criteria, and the other is priority to the worst off, and also financial risk protection, so broadening the scope of the framework. So in that sense, at the guidance level, there's been some uptake, and also in some countries, this extra priority to the worst off in guidelines for priority setting. So both the UK, Norway, the Netherlands have implemented an extra priority to people who are worse off in health terms, but it hasn't really been applied yet widely, where we plug in other well-being measures and do full analysis, except the work that Chris mentioned. So combining all these different elements is very exciting and a growing field, at least in my area of distributional cost effectiveness analysis and so-called extended cost effectiveness analysis. So we see a lot of new research coming out and some policy uptake.
Could we also talk about the use of these frameworks in low-income countries and whether or not they've been applied to date, or whether that's work that still needs to be done? Although I'm not sure if that's one for you or if others would like to jump in there.
Yeah, I can briefly mention our center is involved in a very interesting study in India, for instance, where we look at nutritional policies. So these will be different policies that can improve food intake and better nutritional intake in areas with a lot of malnutrition. And we see that these policies can improve health, but they can also improve cognition, development of children, school attendance, so a lot of these other benefits. And there are several standard cost effectiveness analysis also looking at cost benefit analysis looking at this, but I think when we apply the more prioritarian framework, we can also capture distribution. So this is very relevant in low income countries. Also traffic regulation, air pollution, all these other issues are so relevant. And typically public health interventions and intersectoral interventions can have a very good benefit cost ratio compared to more standard treatment interventions in the health area, for instance. So it's very important to generate this evidence, but we have fewer of these studies in benefit cost analysis and in this area than for new drugs, AIDS therapy, and so on. So there is a bias in the academic literature here.
I'm just conscious we're coming up to the top of the hour. My parting question to the panel is, given the problematic normative assumptions that we know are baked into benefit cost analysis, to what extent do you think that as an approach for evaluating policy, it needs to be completely overthrown, or to what extent does it just need to be supplemented by these alternative measures?
I mean, I'll jump in there. No, so it certainly should not be completely overthrown. I mean, in the US, it's been incredibly successful, and successful, in arguing not just to reduce regulation, but also in arguing for more regulation. So, for example, cost-benefit analysis has been used to show just the incredible, benefits of air pollution regulations, right? And we're now taking kind of climate effects and cost-benefit through the social cost of carbon. So my view is, along with cost-benefit, we need intensive methods development. I mean, what's amazing to me about the UK, with Chris Krekel and the people he's working with, is the extent to which, starting with just the academic idea of subjective well-being, 20 years ago, that this is the methods for implementing that, has occurred. So with sufficient effort, we can do that. And my view is, I would hope that the academic community and governments can start developing those methods, at least in the US or elsewhere, use that as, along with or as a supplement to cost-benefit analysis, but not as a replacement. I mean, in 100 years, should it replace it? Maybe, but not right now.
100 years, huh? I'm hoping it's faster than that. But I agree with Matt 100%, and I think part of the reason why we got started on this whole path with the conference and this meetup, and it's been a theme of Matt's work, my work, other people's work, is that we're aware that benefit cost analysis needs to be improved, but there's a lot of steps we need to go through. I also want to make the point that if we jump to a different approach too fast, I think I like the idea of doing conventional benefit cost analysis and supplementing it with these other things, because if we jump to new approach too fast, we're going to be using unproven methods, and that's going to create its own problems. But there's another reason, that also has to do with the fact that it's so well established, is that for most of the policies I've worked on, the most important finding has had nothing to do with how we value costs and benefits. It has to do with the fact that we have a systematic approach. We're required to poke at the problem. So all of a sudden, we find out that a policy that, on the surface we thought was terrific is impossible. We had one analysis that we did where that would have required testing of a substance down to a point where it would have been, I forget what it was, hundreds of thousands of dollars per test. So it's completely infeasible, but nobody realized that until the benefit cost analysis made us do that. So I think we need a systematic approach that people know how to apply so we can discover these things, in addition to trying to address all these valuation and ethical issues.
So that's interesting. The value that cost benefit analysis brings is that demand for measurability in the first place, which forces us to unpack policies that would otherwise, potentially seem to be, okay, very, very interesting. Well, look, I'm sorry we didn't get to cover all of the questions in the chat. It's been a really fascinating discussion. So thank you all for your contributions. Really appreciate your attention and participation. And thanks also to the panelists for sharing their expertise and allowing us to go into such depth in a relatively short space of time. So very grateful to all of you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Sally, for leading us, and thank you to the foundation for supporting all this work. It's been terrific.
You are welcome. Have a great day.
Thanks so much.